the beginning, people would say he's arrogant, but I don't think so.
Okay, picture this. Paul Simon, the soft-spoken legend behind some of the most poetic lyrics of the 20th century, is sitting by his window in Manhattan, scribbling furiously into a notebook. Not with inspiration, but with irritation. That's right. Beneath the calm exterior of this musical genius is a man who's been quietly keeping receipts. Not for chart success, but for personal offenses. We're talking the kind of subtle slights and creative betrayals that don't make tabloid headlines, but live rent-free in the minds of artists for decades. This isn't just about beef, folks. This is about ideology, authenticity, and the deep wounds that only fellow musicians can inflict. Paul Simon isn't out here flipping tables or subtweeting on social media. Instead, he lets his music, and sometimes his silence, do the talking. But make no mistake, just because he's quiet doesn't mean he's chill. Far from it. This intro sets the tone for a different kind of celebrity drama, one that unfolds backstage in cold stares, offhand comments, and unreturned phone calls. It's less Real Housewives, more HBO prestige drama. And trust me, the list he's made, it's not petty, it's personal. Stick around. This rabbit hole is deeper than you think. Paul Simon versus Bob Dylan. All right, so let's talk about the folk music feud we never knew we needed, Paul Simon versus Bob Dylan. Now, on paper, this should have been a bromance for the ages. Two lyrical heavyweights, two voices that helped define an entire generation. But when these two finally met, it wasn't creative fireworks. It was a silent, slow burn of disappointment that still lingers in the air like leftover incense at a 1960s poetry reading. It started with reverence. Young Paul admired Dylan. He studied his lyrics like sacred text. But then came the fateful real-life meeting. Instead of kindred spirits locking arms in musical solidarity, Paul was met with Dylan's signature aloofness. And not the mysterious, charming kind. We're talking eyebrow-raised, "You're too clever," muttered at a party kind of cold. Ouch! That offhand comment? It hit Paul like a cymbal crash in a quiet ballad. From that moment, the mentor pedestal crumbled, and a rivalry quietly took its place. They didn't throw punches. They threw subtle jabs. Dylan sneered at Paul's polished songwriting, and Paul clapped back by mocking Dylan's nasal twang. It wasn't war. It was emotional trench warfare. And deep down, Paul wasn't just mad. He was heartbroken. Because when your idol ghosts you with a harmonica, it hurts. When Paul Simon met Lou Reed. Okay, now this next one? It's less musical rivalry and more like two artists showing up to the same party and realizing they'd both rather not be there. Enter Paul Simon and Lou Reed, a match made in opposite ends of the sonic universe. One was all about melody, structure, and finely tuned lyrics. The other? Well, Lou Reed thrived in dissonance, grit, grime, that downtown New York, I woke up in a basement kind of vibe. And Paul, he just didn't get it. From the moment they shared a label, yes, that happened, it was clear they were destined to clash quietly, but intensely. Lou would show up late, sunglasses glued to his face like a shield, arms crossed as if rehearsing for an existential standoff. Paul, ever the craftsman, found Lou's whole vibe just exhausting. He even described Reed's attitude as aggressively hollow, which honestly sounds like a band name, but also tells you everything. Their two interactions were ice cold. The second one? Lou literally walked away mid-sentence. And if you know Paul Simon, you know silence cuts deeper than words. Paul didn't yell. He didn't write a diss track. He just quietly decided Lou Reed was everything he wasn't, and everything he couldn't stand about the direction some music was taking. In the end, their beef wasn't loud, it was legendary in its chill. Paul Simon versus Sting. All right, grab your herbal tea and acoustic guitar, because Chapter 3 is where things get poetically tense. Let's talk about Paul Simon and Sting, two songwriting powerhouses who, on the surface, should have been besties swapping sonnets over wine in Tuscany. But instead, Paul couldn't stand him. Why? Because, to Paul, Sting wasn't a fellow bard. He was theater in a turtleneck. From festival stages to music magazine features, the two were often lumped together as the thinking man's musicians. But Paul? He was not feeling the comparison. He saw Sting's every move as calculated, rehearsed, and dressed up as vulnerability. Where Simon's music came from bruises and late-night heartbreak, Sting's felt more like a well-lit Broadway production. Paul once joked to a colleague that Sting sings like he's solving a riddle for applause. Oof, that's not just shade, that's climate control. The final straw came at a benefit gala in 2002. Sting cracked a joke on stage. Two poets, one mic, trying to charm the crowd, and maybe Simon too. But Paul? He smiled and immediately declined all future duets. That night, he went back to his hotel and poured his irritation into a furious flurry of notebook scribbles. Not lyrics, just emotional housekeeping. For Simon, Sting wasn't the enemy. He was a symbol of what music becomes when polish overtakes pain, when performance masquerades as truth. And in that silent rejection, Paul didn't just say no to Sting. He said no to the whole illusion. Paul Simon versus Ed Sheeran. Now this one hits different, because we're not talking about legends duking it out on vintage vinyl. Nope. Chapter 4 brings us to the new kid on the block, Ed Sheeran. And for Paul Simon, this wasn't a fiery feud. It was more like watching someone borrow your diary, strip out the sadness, and turn it into a Spotify hit. To Paul, Ed didn't steal, he sanitized. At first, Simon was generous. He respected the hustle. Those early Sheeran days, pub gigs, acoustic loops, the charm of bedroom ballads, Paul could relate. But then came the interviews, the name drops, Ed calling Simon a key influence, even referencing Simon and Garfunkel's sound in ways that felt more like replication than reverence. That's when things started to itch. Quietly, Paul began to see Ed's catalog as a hollow echo. Melodic, sure, but missing the soul-bruising weight that made Paul's own songs endure. The real turning point? When Ed dropped a track that nodded to Paul as a creative compass. Instead of feeling honored, Simon felt like a prop in someone else's narrative. He made a call that very day to block joint appearances and festival overlaps. "I'm not his compass," he muttered, mostly to himself. But the message was loud and clear. For Paul, it wasn't personal. Until it was. When your legacy becomes someone else's playlist aesthetic, without the pain behind the poetry, it starts to feel like your truth is being packaged instead of honored. That's not homage, that's heartbreak. Paul Simon versus Madonna. All right, now let's talk about a cultural collision so dramatic, it practically writes itself. Picture this. Paul Simon, the soft-spoken poet with a guitar, crosses paths with Madonna, the high-octane queen of pop spectacle. You already know this wasn't going to end in a duet. For Paul, music was about scars, truth, and quiet reflection. For Madonna, it was performance, provocation, and powerful reinvention. And Paul? He wasn't buying it. From the jump, Simon admired boldness, but only when it came with real vulnerability. Madonna, in his eyes, wasn't bearing her soul. She was selling rebellion like soda pop, wrapping pain in rhinestones and turning it into product. He saw the spectacle, but not the sincerity. To him, it wasn't artistry, it was strategy, slickly executed for maximum attention and minimum emotional risk. The defining moment came at a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame ceremony. Madonna floated across the room like she owned it, because, let's be honest, she kind of did. But when she approached Paul, that infamous smile landed flat. He extended his hand out of sheer politeness, but behind the handshake was disillusionment colder than an unplugged amp. Later, when asked what they talked about, Paul answered with a single word: nothing. And that was the loudest silence of them all. In Simon's world, disinterest is the ultimate diss. The sound of silence. So here we are, at the end of this unexpected tour through the grudges, heartbreaks, and harmonies of Paul Simon's life. And what a ride, right? After diving into 6 very different, very personal fallouts, one thing becomes crystal clear. Paul Simon isn't just a songwriter, he's a silent storyteller. For him, what's unsaid often speaks louder than any chorus. Unlike the loud feuds that fuel Twitter wars or make headline splashes, Paul's discontent lives in the quiet spaces, in the verses he didn't write, the phone calls he didn't return, the stages he didn't share. While others clap back with interviews or Instagram captions, Paul edits with absence. He doesn't scream. He withdraws. And that's his way of saying, I'm done. And honestly, that might be the most poetic part of all. Because for Paul, music has never been about noise. It's been about precision, intention, and emotion sharpened like a blade. So when he chooses not to sing, not to speak, that silence is the song. Whether it was heartbreak with Garfunkel, frustration with Sting, or disillusionment with Madonna, Simon's message stayed the same. Truth matters, even when it hurts. And in a world full of noise, Paul Simon mastered the art of letting silence say everything.